Welcome back. So we've now reached the time of our last two sessions of the day. In a moment, we're going to hear from Professor Madry, who's going to end our session tying together some of the key themes of the day and discuss how we at the AIPF and with our broader community are going to take this work forward. But before we do, we're going to move to our final panel. And for that, we're going to move from AI in healthcare to AI in mobility, and specifically autonomous vehicles. Now, it's increasingly clear that realizing the full benefits of autonomous vehicles, from safety and convenience to alleviating congestion, improving equity, these things are not a given. It's going to present a range of technical, business, policy challenges, all of which are deeply interwoven. And looking at these issues and the necessary policy trade-offs was another topic of one of our AIPF task forces, in which co-chairs Julie Shaw and I were honored to have Jinhua Zhao as a leading participant. Professor Zhao is the director of the MIT Mobility Initiative and joins us today to moderate this next panel on realizing the benefits of autonomous vehicles. And so with that, Jinhua, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of City and Transportation Planning at MIT and the Faculty Director at MIT Mobility Initiative. Today's session, we titled it as Finding Balance in Autonomous Mobility, Safety, Efficiency, and Equity. This is a collaboration between the MIT AI Policy Forum and the MIT Mobility Initiative. Significant technologies rarely come along. They bring with them new human behaviors, new business models, and new social institutions. Autonomous vehicle is a technology of such significance. It forces us to ask, what is transportation for? How do we define success? Are we solving a safety problem here? Are we solving an efficiency problem? Or are we solving an equity problem? The policy framework we design around the autonomous vehicles will shape the entire mobility system toward either a heaven or hell scenario. Specifically, safety, efficiency, and equity. Where are they consistent? And where are they potentially conflicting? Ideally, we hope to improve all three of them simultaneously. But when we reach the Pareto frontier, where the tension between the three become unavoidable, how will we make these choices? Who should make these choices? Joining me today is a distinguished panel from the academia, business, and the government. Emily Frazzoli, Don Woodard, Prashanti Raman, and Mark Rosekind. Please project everybody's face into the panel so that I like the audience see the five of us together have a conversation rather than individual presentation. All right. So the first round, I will interview each of you individually upon questions. And in round two, I will invite each of the panelists to respond to what you just heard from the other panelists and add your thought to this. And also to the audience, I really encourage everybody to put one thought, either comments or question to the panelists so that we have a good conversation between the panel and the audience. Before I start, I want to thank John Movanzadi and Surab Amin for designing this panel. I thank Aleksander Madry and Asu Delga for organizing the whole AI forum. So Emily, I will start with you. You're a professor at MIT and at ETH Zurich, and also co-founder of Autonomy and the chief scientist at Aptiv's Autonomous Mobility Group. During our previous discussion, we talked about that we actually do not know how do we want the vehicle to behave. Traffic rules is only an incomplete social contract. It cannot prescribe the exact behavior for each possible scenarios. Human drivers fill this gap using our common sense. But as of today, it is still very hard for AI to acquire this common sense. So how do we envision the autonomous vehicle operate in much of these gray areas? How do the AV designers make such a decision? And what role do you see public policy play from this? Emily.
Hit the nail on the head right away. It took me a while as I started working first on autonomous vehicles because everybody was saying that it's important for safety, right? But then I really started thinking of getting excited about the whole industry when I started thinking of autonomous vehicles as robotaxis, right? So something that is providing like a shared service, right? But and then as I started working on this, I developed some ways in which algorithms by which I could translate what I thought would be the rules of the road and translate them into behaviors, and I thought that was done, right? And that was about 2013. But then as I started doing this work, I realized that really the big problem is that the rules of the road, as we know them, have been designed by humans. Actually, their origin, surprisingly enough, interestingly enough, is to be traced to the way that people were supposed to control. So yeah, it was really a lot of the rules of the road were, traced their origin to the way that people were supposed to handle animals, like shepherds, like leading sheep and or horses and things like that. But and so we're designed by humans for human consumption. But what you realize is that this is, as a set of rules, is very incomplete. It's not sound. It's not completely consistent. And in fact, what I say today is that the biggest problem for me for developing autonomous vehicle technology is not perception, is not LiDARs or versus cameras, is not controls, it's not planning, but it's really deciding what the behavior of this car should be. And I think that the biggest problem is that we don't know clearly how we as a society want cars to behave, and that includes both human-driven and computer-driven cars. Now, and this applies both to the single car point of view, how should a single car behave, how should a single car interact with other robotic car and human-driven cars, but also applies to the whole, like a whole fleet of cars, right? So if I have 10,000 of these cars in a city and I want to provide some kind of a service, how should I manage this fleet? How should I offer the service that I want to offer? Now, and the problem that I see in this is that in engineering school, we are taught from the beginning that the first thing that you do before you start on a designing project is to write down the requirements, the specifications. And then only that you start the design process. Now, with autonomous vehicle, what it seems to me is that we started, just developing this technology, but it is not clear to us how this technology should be implemented, how it should be deployed, what we want out of it. And these are all the things that we are kind of like discovering along the way, which is not the best way to do it. But I think that here we have an opportunity, right? So we know it's a technology that is coming, will have a major impact on society in the years to come. But we have an opportunity now before this technology is actually deployed to really set the rules, right? So try to figure out what the regulations, what are the policies that should be put in place in such a way that these cars will actually provide a tangible benefit to society. Now, who should set these rules? Well, for me, it's society, right? So through really their elected representatives or the institutions that have the mandate to regulate transportation and traffic. I think that this is something that it really should not be left to the technology company to define. Of course, if nobody decides, they will have to come up with something, right? But I think that really we have an opportunity as a community really to set the stage and really decide what we want out of this technology.
Thank you, Leo. As you mentioned, if there's a policy vacuum, the designer had to make some decisions, right? So therefore, it has to be a process well-defined to enable this process. So one follow-up question is on that is, you're one of the first research group really demonstrate the robo-taxi as a model for mobility can significantly impact the overall urban traffic, right? So here, can you comment a little bit about the difference between the fleet-based deployment, we call the robo-taxi style, versus private ownership model, which is the dominant mode today? And also, what's the difference between the individual vehicle behavior versus the fleet-based behavior on this?
Right. It's another excellent question. So, well, if you think about it, the game-changing feature of the technology that we are developing is the fact that cars now can travel by themselves with no humans on board, okay? And that is really the game-changing feature. Why is it game-changing? Because from my point of view, once you have a car that can drive itself with nobody on board, then it actually, I mean, you can own it, right? So, I mean, you can, keep it parked, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? So, but, and, this ability for me really provides enables really like a shared mobility and individual, like a point-to-point mobility at scale. This is something that cannot be done today with any other approach, right? So because you have mass transit, but mass transit cannot be point-to-point, right? Or like a cater to the individual. And there are just not enough taxi drivers in the world, right? Or Uber drivers in the world to provide the kind of individual mass access that we will need. Okay, so I think that, that is really the main benefit. Now, as I was saying, if you have a car that can drive itself with nobody on board, really doesn't make a lot of sense to have it for yourself only and keep it parked, right? So you have a capability that is not being used. And in fact, you should, there are these you mentioned the heaven or hell, right? So there are these scenarios where people think of like zombie cars that drive around the block because you cannot find parking, right? So while the owner is shopping or dining at the restaurant. But, these are all undesirable things that you can regulate, right? So, for example, you could impose fees on usage of shared infrastructure like roads. And these fees can be different if you're carrying a passenger or if the car is driving empty. So you can imagine ways that you can discourage the bad behaviors, right? And encourage the good ones. But I really think that the main game-changing feature that we need to think about is if the car can drive itself with nobody on board, then how would this change the landscape of mobility?
Thank you, Emilio. So Don Woodard, thank you for joining us today. Before you started at Lincoln, you were the Senior Director of Data Science and Machine Learning at Uber. And before that, as a full professor of statistics and operation research at Cornell, right? Uber obviously offers in this fleet-based model that Emilio just mentioned, right? How would the AV application change the nature of Uber's business? For example, from a two-sided market, you have driver and consumer, to a one-sided market where you only have a consumer to deal with, and a potential change from asset light to asset heavy, depending on what's the partnership structure between Uber and the manufacturers, right? Within the fleet base, there's also another important detail, which is the single ride versus the pooled ride, and how would that impact the traffic? So tell us your observation when you're at Uber.
Great, thanks. Great to be here. My own background is in transportation and mobility solutions in a variety of different areas. You mentioned Uber, and before that, I was working with emergency vehicle services on optimizing their fleets and on bike sharing, in addition to mapping services during a time at Microsoft. So from this perspective, I would call out two things that really relate to this forum, and you mentioned one of them, which is really important around as we think of ride sharing and introduction of AV, how does that change the ride sharing picture? Obviously, ride sharing is one of the applications that people have really pointed to as an area where AV would really change the picture in a very meaningful way. And so if you think about these ride sharing systems right now, they are two-sided platforms with riders on one side and drivers on the other side. And the majority of the payments that riders make go to drivers. And in an AV world, that could change substantially. There are a couple of things to keep in mind there. One is, yes, as you mentioned, you could go to a capital heavy business model where the platform owns the autonomous vehicles, or you could continue to have a two-sided platform in which you have riders on one side and then vehicle owners on the other side of the platform who are providing their vehicles for a fee to the platform. So there are a couple different business models in this area. Another thing I would call out is the fact that this wouldn't be a 0 to 100% transition by any stretch of the imagination. There are two practical reasons why that's not the case. One is that ride-sharing systems really operate at broad scale across the geographies, right? So many cities and outlying suburban and even semi-rural areas are covered by these services. And currently, autonomous vehicles require high resolution mapping of the road network and experience with this particular area of the road network. And so scaling up autonomy to cover the entire coverage of current ride-sharing services is something that requires a very large geographic expansion of those technologies. Additionally, keep in mind that ride-sharing services, the demand fluctuates a great deal over the course of a week. So you have in the middle of the night, relatively low demand, and during the peak times in the day, quite high demand. And so it actually doesn't, so think about a capital heavy business model, for example, where the platform owns the vehicles. It would not make sense in that context to buy enough vehicles to cover peak times, most likely. It would probably make more sense to purchase autonomous vehicles to cover the baseline demand that happens at most times of the day, and then to continue to have driver vehicles to cover peak demand. So continue with a two-sided marketplace model to cover those peak demands. So it probably will be a mixed fleet well into the future with components of the current business model. So those are some thoughts about ride sharing as an area of application for AVs. I'll also call out that ride sharing is an area where we've had to deal with these considerations around safety, around efficiency, around congestion at scale already, right? And so, I have some thoughts on that and happy to share. And so for example, ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft have been operated large-scale pooling services in many countries pre-COVID. And I think maybe are starting to reintroduce some of those pooled services as well. And so as we look towards how do we scale up on shared transportation that can really deliver at high volumes as the demand for the use of our fixed transportation infrastructures that continues to boom. How do we create the incentives for shared transportation at scale? And how do we do that via a partnership between the transportation agencies and policymakers on one hand who create the incentives on which these private companies operate. And on the other hand, it's really important to have the private companies as part of that picture because they have extremely sophisticated matching and optimization technology available. And once you get the incentives right, they can really contribute a lot to our ability to increase throughput in an equitable and cost-effective way for large amounts of our population.
Right. And thank you, Don. Yeah, one thing you mentioned that the transitional period will be a long and important period. Indeed, in the extreme cases, 100% AV as a control system is actually relatively easy. And if a 100% human driver, we know at least how to deal with it, even though the situation is not necessarily optimal. It's the in-between that's where the complexity, both in the technology sense, but also in the policy sense and the human behavior sense that really comes out, right? So I want to ask you another question is that, I'd like to see a particular example where safety and efficiency, they may reach a point that they may conflict, right? We discussed the potential that the AV may make certain routing choices that can either optimize towards efficiency or towards a better safety condition, right? Can you elaborate a little bit more about that example?
Sure. So routing is a context in which so routing in the road network, how do we route an autonomous vehicle or a driver driven vehicle in the road network? What is that optimal route? This is a set of considerations around how do you weight different kinds of turns and maneuvers of different kinds. So obviously impacts both safety and definitely efficiency in the road network. Our experience in terms of building these turn-by-turn navigation systems for drivers in the ride-sharing context is that, well, first of all, as you're improving that navigation service. For a long time, the improvements improve both safety and efficiency. So a lot of times these things are actually not in direct conflict. And it really is, if you create a route that's safe, a driver is much more likely to follow it, right? If you make a mistake and route a driver to take a left-hand turn that's illegal, they won't follow it. And so it causes efficiency loss, because the driver ends up having to do a different maneuver to make up for the fact that you've created a mistake, right? Or even if you provide a driver with something that's not illegal, but suboptimal from a safety perspective, they often override the navigation service. Now, this all changes in the autonomous world. You can't make these sorts of mistakes, but a lot of times, actually creating an efficient route is very much also about creating a safe route that the driver wants to follow. There is an extreme at which, if you say, for example, so left-hand turns are slightly less safe than right-hand turns and going straight. And so you could, for example, say no left-hand turns allowed. Well, that is an extreme position that would dramatically impact efficiency. So what is more practical in practice is to say, okay, we should downweight maneuvers that are less safe and upweight maneuvers that are more safe as part of a routing system, and rather than completely eliminating an entire category of maneuvers, for example.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Prashant, great to have you here today at the panel. You're the Vice President of Global Government Affairs at Cruise, and prior to that, you work at Lyft as the Director State and the local government. So Cruise is really going full scale into the robotaxi vision of the future. So what do you see as some of the challenges that you encounter working with various government regulators to bring this vision to fruition? So where do you see the policy that's necessary to bring this whole industry really need versus some policies or action rules that really stifle the innovation, right? Let's know your thought on this, please.
Thank you. And thank you to MIT and to Jinhua for having me on this incredibly esteemed panel and for engaging Cruise on this exciting policy landscape. As you had shared, I am the Vice President of Global Government Affairs at Cruise and previously was at Lyft for 5.5 years. I'm actually a healthcare lawyer by way of background, and wasn't until I was appointed by the governor of Illinois to run his healthcare legislative affairs and was serendipitously handed the ride-sharing bill in 2014. Was I on the track that would not have gotten me here to tech and transportation? So really those serendipitous moments count. For those of you who are less familiar with us, allow me to introduce Cruise a little bit, and then I will definitely be answering your question in my comments. Cruise is an all-electric, self-driving company based in San Francisco, which is also where we will first launch our commercial ride-hail service. We were founded in 2013 and have had made tremendous progress in making a cleaner, safer, and more inclusive transportation a reality. Cruise is the first AV company in California to be permitted to carry members of the public in a driverless vehicle. We are also in the process of pursuing our final deployment permit from the California Public Utilities Commission, which will allow us to carry members of the public in driverless vehicles for a fare. We also operate a fully electric fleet today and are to date the only AV company to power our vehicles with fully renewable electricity, which we source from farms in California's Central Valley through our farm to fleet partnership. So we strongly believe that AV future must be all electric, given that transportation is the largest source of emissions in the United States, and that environmental harm is disproportionately felt by communities of color. And is why we are both passionate about that topic today, but also I'm excited to be part of the conversation and hopefully a small step towards a solution in the future. We know that we must win the tech race and the trust race, and that is true to both the general public and with regulators alike. With any innovative technology, whether it be ride-hail with Lyft and Uber and now Cruise, particularly one that has the potential to make changes to something that everyone uses, transportation, there is a lot of education and relationship building that we have to do and continue to do. There are also unique challenges in every state's transportation landscape that makes this challenging as we grow and scale our work. We see this actually in different approaches, like states like Arizona and Texas, which is very sort of open in terms of room to give companies for technological innovation and iteration, compared to even states like California, which is known to be the future of innovation in terms of their leadership, but has a much more step-by-step permitting approach for AV companies with the dual regulator system, which is very unique. At the federal level, AV companies face barriers to scale deployment due to the existing cap on manufacturing vehicles that really lack those human-centered features that we've been seeing for decades and centuries. This comes despite a seemingly increasingly willingness from DOT to have conversations and engagement around AVs, innovation, and technology that can be used to make transportation more accessible, sustainable, and safe. With news just this week that nearly 43,000 people died on American roads last year, including significant increases in pedestrian and cyclist fatalities, we cannot wait to act to ensure that AV tech continues to grow and scale here in the United States. Meanwhile, we know the competition in the AV space is not slowing down. We look at companies in China that are speeding forward with deployment with regulatory frameworks. Japan and European counterparts are also moving regulatory visions forward. And so it's really critical that the US not be left behind if we want to continue keeping this research and development and the entire AV ecosystem of jobs here in the United States. So really ensuring regulators and elected officials understand that urgency here is critically important. We are also confronting the status quo of American infrastructure, where our electrical systems are outdated or ill-prepared for the massive EV growth that is coming, which we're seeing acutely with our all-electric vehicle today, even hyper-locally at that. Making sure regulators and elected officials see the whole picture and the entirety of the benefits that AVs can bring for their communities economically and on a road safety level continues to be an area of focus for us. So thank you for having me again today, and look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prashanti. So last but not least, it's really my pleasure to have Mark Roskine to join us today. Mark, you're the Chief Safety Innovation Officer at Zoox, and also was the 15th Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, under President Obama. So from one side, you have the view of the nation's top autonomous automotive safety regulator. The other side, now you operate in the small but very growing, robust Silicon Valley startup. So tell us about your journey, right? How's your view evolved between the different roles? Particularly, I like to say that in order for the whole system to work well, there are certain tasks, it should be done by individual company, but certain tasks should be done by industry as a whole through alliances and negotiations among the companies, and certain tasks should be done by the government, but through DOT, through mandate, right? So where do you see the division between the labor among these different entities? Please, Mark.
Let's begin with the actual number that got released this week. In the United States, 42,915 people lost their lives on US roads. And so for me, emphatically, for all of our discussions, safety has to be at the top. And I always push people knowing that exact number, because those are mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, your colleagues, your community members, et cetera. We need to know that number. It went up 10.5%. Everyone's calling it a crisis. The reality is we've been in crisis for 20, 30 years. You know, it's like we've become complacent that this is okay. It is not okay. And so as administrator at NHTSA, you really have to look at the whole system, right? I mean, if we want to make a difference and not just cite the numbers, how do we change that? And what's interesting is, the three big things that we know can make a difference here are, well, let's keep doing the stuff we know that works. Education programs, certain, high visibility enforcement. Let's keep doing that. 2, let's implement other things we know that work that really needs more focus, like safe systems, okay? But the third thing that is absolutely a new tool for us is technology and the innovation that comes with that technology. So that's something I think we have to be very clear about. We have a chance now in our societal transformation, and you've talked about 3 things. Let me sort of give my 3 version of that, which is I think we go after safety, we go after mobility for our society, and we have a moment now to also go after sustainability and climate. Use this as an inflection point for electrification. And you brought it out in your 3. Across all of those is the equity opportunity for communities, and not just geographic communities, but different kinds of communities of people. Absolutely. So from the NHTSA perspective, if you want to make that change to see us literally get to 0 or as reduce as much as possible the loss of life, the injuries, the crashes, you need a big system perspective. And to your point, that means the government can't fix all of that. One new technology can't fix all of that. One company can't fix all that. A bunch of companies together can't necessarily fix all of that. The most brilliant safety advocates can't necessarily fix all that. And so I think, to the point of your question, we are at this moment where if we get all of the system working together, government doing its role, legacy OEMs doing their role, new technology companies doing their role, and all of us as drivers, riders, etc., playing a part as well, we have a chance to truly change the safety equation of what's been going on for decades in the United States. And I think that sets up your first part of the question is, I have that perspective. So since being a NASA scientist, I've always focused on safety, not just keeping astronauts and pilots awake on the job, but generally, how do we make the system safer? Prior to NHTSA at the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, as a board member, your job is to understand probable cause and crashes so you can make recommendations so they don't happen again. So again, emphatically for me, it's about the safety. And so returning to your original question, what's been fascinating for me is to make this transition from that larger federal, the whole national perspective to Zoox, which basically was an opportunity to literally be in the room as we make this transition. And I wanted a chance to be around all these brilliant, the engineers and all the other people that are building these systems. Because let's be clear, the government doesn't actually build these new technologies and new systems, right? I mean, those are up to, in this sense, legacy OEMs, technology companies, et cetera. I wanted to be in the room to ensure safety is a core value. It is foundational to everything that we are doing, because I think first principle, that's where you start, okay? And I think just very quickly, Zoox actually is interesting, and part of the reason I went there is because it's fully autonomous, it's fully electric, it's focused on ride sharing in congested cities. So it's trying to go after all of it, the safety, the mobility, and the sustainability, and the equity, okay? And I think I'd like to just sort of finish this part with, as you pointed out, there is no one part of the system that can fix all of this. So even if Zoox had a perfect system and vehicle on the road, it's still in a system with other vehicles, other scooters, other pedestrians, et cetera. You need the whole system focused on enhancing safety, not just one element of it, okay? And so I think that's one of the challenges now, is that we understand what the issues are, but more significantly is what actions do we take to actually bring about those changes and do everything we can to optimize the benefits. Because it'd be great to save half those lives. It's even better if we get all the way there.
Indeed. Mark, thanks so much. Emily, I see, please jump in. You're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Jinhua. And Mark, thank you for the comments. Now, the one thing that I noticed is that every single company working in this space always talks about safety is #1 for us. Safety is, our main thing. We want to reduce the number of accidents and save lives, and that's great. That's fantastic. Right? However, from my perspective, when I was doing these things, right, in the company that used to be my own, is that what exactly do we mean by safety? I think that once you go beyond the big proclamations that people say, safety is #1 for us, and you look at the details of what exactly do we mean by safety in this particular instance, what is safety? For example, if we want to say that, okay, for me, safety means that our car will never hit a pedestrian. Yeah, okay, but what if a pedestrian suddenly jumps off the street right into the road? What should we do? Should all the autonomous cars be ready for the case in which a pedestrian decides to suddenly jump off, into the road, right, in their path. And then should we be ready for that? And these are all questions that are resolved. A lot of the rules of the road are predicated on an idea of like a right of way, but there is no definition anywhere of what right of way means. Then you read articles and say, well, a problem with autonomous vehicles is that actually autonomous vehicles on the highway drive the speed limit, and that is unsafe because all humans drive faster than the speed limit. And so what should we do, right? So if we want, what is the right thing? So I see that there are a lot of, there is this overarching concept that everybody wants safety. I don't know of any single company that says, yeah, I don't care about my vehicle be unsafe. I prioritize other things. Clearly, everybody wants safety. However, we don't know exactly what we mean by safety. And I think that this is a very important missing piece, because before up to the point where somebody tells us, I think of myself as a technology person, what safety means exactly, precisely, we are spinning our wheels, and we don't really know what to do, right? And I think that this is a big problem.
Yeah,
and I think it's not up to us to decide.
That's great. I will invite Mark to offer his response. I just want to add one thing before that, which is, prior conversation Mark we're having, we observed that the airline industry and the land-based traffic has an entirely different notion of what's acceptable, right? In airline industry, the effective acceptable rate is 0, right? While in the traffic, Mark just quote how many people die in this, right? So how does society make such a choice, right? Why we have such contrasting standard upon different things? Yeah, Mark, please.
So this is great. and Emilio, let me tell you, this is an NTSB thing for me, but I hate it. It makes me crazy when people say safety is our #1 priority, because priorities change, and tomorrow it's scheduled, the next day it's the budget, the next day it's the, right? And the second part is exactly what you're honing in on, is you have to be explicit about what you mean by safety. Now, just to be concrete, this is why I went to Zooks, is we actually, my title, Chief Safety Innovation Officer, no one else has that title, is to emphasize our focus on safety innovation as much as all the cool technology innovation. So you should go zooks.com/safety, and we actually have a report that talks about all the safety innovations that have been built into our vehicle that has been designed from the ground up specifically for autonomy. We have over 100 safety innovations that don't exist in cars today, okay? And we highlight 9 of those. And I'm not gonna get into all that stuff, but I think that's what you're talking about. You have to go from the big picture to specifically what are you doing to translate that into actually saving lives, preventing injuries and crashes. Now, here's the scary part for you, which kind of gets to Jinhua's comment. In road safety, we don't really have any definition specifically of what that means to be safe. It should be scary. In fact, if you look at the NHTSA authorities for defect, et cetera, huge authorities, but that is related to an unreasonable risk to safety, but that's not defined, okay? So that is one of the biggest problems. And Jinhua, to your point, in aviation, basically, they went a dozen years with no fatalities in commercial aviation, okay? Where 95% of the lives lost, those are on the road. All right. And I think one of the things we talked about is, one of the problems is that in road safety, manufacturers actually compete on safety. Whereas in aviation, they don't compete. It's everybody's job to make it safe for people. And NHTSA actually contributes to that competition through the new car assessment program, the stars for cars. And I mentioned this, it's like, you would never get on an airplane looking for the stars on the side of the cockpit. Is that a 5 or a 4? Right? But in the road safety, it's to your point, a totally different mindset for our culture, right? And so those, just to be clear, that's an example of the deep-seated societal kinds of images, concepts, and how we approach safety that's so different, that's going to be hard for us to overcome.
This is brilliant. So let's move on to the second round of the discussion there, right? I like each panelist to reflect on what is heard, etc. But I will start with Prashanti, then go to Don, then to Emilio and Mark again. But before I invite Prashanti on this, I do want to remind the audience, please start to put your question and answers in. Don't need to wait for the last session, right? So we'll accumulate all these questions, and then we'll, as much as we can, we'll entertain many of them so that panelists can offer response. Prashanti.
Is there a question, or you want me to just respond to the?
Respond to what you just said about the whole panel. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of the questions that is always said, as you stated, is something about safety. And so I really do agree with Mark, is that there is no one factor. And so I think it's a multitude of things. And for each company that's sort of going through this is creating what that holistic framework looks like for themselves, whether it is looking at the continuous improvement cycle, how they are testing, how they are operating, what is their remote assistance capabilities, where's the customer safety. And so safety is sort of an umbrella term for multiple functions, and we continue to have to iterate what safety means within each of those functions. And so making differences on overall safety for vulnerable users saves lives. We know that, but it prevents the trauma, it prevents sort of the numbers that are, we've been discussing today. But we shouldn't just stop innovation until we all agree on that, on what that safety metric is. We've discussed, sort of, Mark's been very experienced in this, but, is there a federal safety framework that's coming from this? There is a lot of iteration and discussion that needs to be housed. And so the industry as a whole can come up with that. Or is that something that is supposed to be dictated by the regulatory authorities that be? And I think that tension remains. And so that the focus is there, but until there's an understanding that one metric is not going to be what is considered safe. It is a multitude of factors that go into an entire system from an autonomous vehicle standpoint that will make the actual operations functionality improvement and the consumer experience that way.
Thanks for presenting. Dao?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation around safety. I'd love to hear more from the rest of the panel around some of the other considerations, in particular, as we think about efficiency and congestion as a part of efficiency. AVs have a really important impact on both efficiency and congestion. And so, I'll call out one thing from the ride sharing perspective, but I'm really interested to hear from the rest of the panel as well about how do we really make this work at scale, right? Adoption will only happen if it's efficient, right? We can be as safe as we want, but if it's incredibly slow, then nobody will actually use it. And so as we look at the congestion question and this aspect of how do we increase the efficiency of the existing road network, and I'll just pause and note that we have an existing transportation infrastructure. It's extremely difficult to expand that transportation infrastructure, but we've over time developed a number of really remarkable technologies for optimizing on that infrastructure. But congestion seems to be the biggest barrier to really leveraging those in order to increase throughput. So just to give some examples of creative ways that ride-sharing services have used the public-private partnerships. Uber has provided services for subsidized transportation for small cities, for example, in cases where it doesn't make financial sense for a city to run a bus line because the demand is not high enough, or for specific types of demand at low volume that it can make more sense for a city to simply subsidize rides on a ride-hailing platform instead through a partnership. So that's one example of these kinds of partnerships. Another creative example is that some of these ride-sharing services have tested multimodal journeys in the application, where you can open the app and request a ride that includes a train ride as part of that, as well as a solution to the first and last mile problem by a ride sharing solution. So how do we make this work at scale is my question.
Dao, thank you for bringing the efficiency into the discussion here. Emily, I see these here. And let me add two remarks before I bring Emily into this. The first one is that in order to improve the overall mobility system efficiency, the key thing is the vehicle occupancy, right? For each vehicle, have more than one person into this, right? What Uber Pool and Lyft Line is showing that in the United States context, seems we couldn't find a pricing point that's low enough to attract people to pool and high enough for the company to make money. Right. And this is the potential based on the societal baseline preference towards sharing. And when AV comes in, I worry that it may be even worse, because there'd be two strangers sitting in the cocoon, the machine there. Today, at least we don't have a driver controlling the general space, right? So that's one question, a challenge there. The second one I also added to the congestion discussion is the induced demand. And we know that the lower the demand, the lower the cost, the higher the demand. And if the cost approaching zero, the people consume irresponsibly, right? So here, this type of question is really challenging. That's a key question as a society we need to kind of wrestle with. Emily, let us know your thought on this.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jinhua, for the question, and thanks, Don, also for bringing the attention back to the efficiency. I think that safety is great, it's fantastic, everybody wants it, but I think it will be a long time before AVs are actually safer than human-driven vehicles. So, I think it's important for us to focus on what are the other benefits that the technology can bring. From my point of view, the autonomous vehicle, the robotaxi, really provides another option in a spectrum of mobility offering, right? So it's not something that will substitute, say, mass transit, or it will complement mass transit and will complement private transportation. I think of it, somebody mentioned sustainability. I think that's important also, from essentially way of offering. I think of it as a robotaxi, something with the sustainability of public transport, but with the convenience of private transport. Now, and I think that there are a lot of options in this spectrum, right? So, for example, nobody can deny that the best way to bring a whole lot of people from point A to point B quickly is the train, right? It's something like a train or a subway. But now the problem is that the train is great only if the train is full. For example, I've done a lot of this analysis in Switzerland, where I'm working these days. And what we found is that there are some rural lines where the train, a regularly scheduled train service is offered, but very few passengers. So in those cases, it may actually be more efficient from the environment and also from a financial point of view and from the passenger point of view to scrap the train line and have like a service of on-demand taxis, right? So I think that there is a whole lot of options that we need to explore of how to integrate robotaxi into a more in a system-wide notion of mobility. And that also includes ride sharing, ride pooling, however you want to call it. Now, what things that I've seen is that the only cases in which a ride pooling actually works are actually cases in which you may just as well have a line service between those points. So again, I think that we really need to be a little bit creative and think a little bit out of the box on how to integrate this like a point-to-point mobility enabled by autonomous vehicle with more traditional approaches to mobility, and without having a theorem in mind to prove that, oh, I think that like a pooling is the answer, because it may not be the answer. But really looking at the data and the mobility, demand and what the technology can offer to decide really what is the right mixture and what is the right design of a mobility system in a particular city or in a particular region. And the answer may change region by region.
Right. Thank you. So before I invite Mark to offer your observation of the whole discussion up to now, still on the efficiency question, a commonly utilized tool is congestion pricing, right? So I do want to get your people's view on this. I mean, this Pigouvian taxation as a notion was set up 100 years ago. Its a specific application to transportation was set up a half a century ago. But in practice, we only have a handful of cities in the world actually practice it, right? I'd like to hear from you guys on what's your thought on the congestion charting in general, but more specifically, when we apply congestion charting to autonomous vehicle, any specific additional discussion we should incur here?
So great discussion.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say great discussion, and I'm going to just move us backwards for a moment because almost everybody has raised the issue of policy. And so I just want to make a quick comment about that. In the United States, most people aren't familiar with the fact that it can take 8 to 10 years to come out with a regulation in the traditional pipeline of how you do that. So in this realm, when you're looking at technology innovation that changes every minute or two, when you're regulating around a certain kind of technology, 8 years later, when it comes out, it's basically, why did you bother? Okay. So I think one of the models I often talk to people about is we need to do innovation. That should drive data-driven best practices. That will set the foundation for regulation. And I think, again, each of the panels have raised this, but the regulatory part, and you said this earlier, the government has a role, but it's only one piece of it. And the regulation should help codify a lot of this stuff at some point, but it's only after you've determined through data and the best practices what's really going to work. Okay, which kind of brings us back to the efficiency part. And I would actually say your question's really interesting because it focused on congestion, but I would say let's add electrification, or at least some alternate fuel to that as well. Okay, which is, again, if we want to use this as an inflection point for climate change and sustainability issues, then let's go for all of it. And related to the policy part, which is what we're talking about, I think we need to figure out what the potential incentives and disincentives are for people to follow these models are going to make a difference. And I'll just comment that I think this is a perfect example of where we need more pilot programs and really innovative models that we quantify what works, what doesn't. I know when I used to talk to states and they said, oh, we'd like to do X, Y, Z. And I would often say, well, good, you do X, you do Y, you do Z, and then let's pull it all together and figure out which is the one that worked best, and where we're not just what you learn, but also what you don't want to be doing. I think that's what you're talking about here is really needed. As you point out, it's a handful of cities that have actually, taken this on with the practicality is what does it mean in our actual geography here. And so I think it's a beautiful area that's right for congestion plus electrification. And if we could see some cities come up with those models, not even in the whole city, right, but maybe just downtown congestion, et cetera, and then compare those models, it brings up this other part is we need more data. This is the scientist in me saying we need to quantify this so we can base at least part of our judgment on whether or not the certain models that people have is ride sharing of autonomous vehicle really going to make a difference? Well, prove it. Let's show that those benefits can exist with innovative models, and then let the data drive what actually moves forward.
Great, thanks, Mark. There are the two important points you point out: the clock speed of regulation and the data sharing. But let me come back to Don for continuing the discussion a little bit on the congestion pricing. Then we'll get back to the regulation again. Right? But Don, please.
I think personally, I think that congestion pricing is an incredibly powerful tool for incentivizing shared rides on the road network, and it's this obvious point about the limited infrastructure and the externality that every driver on the roadway imposes on everybody else. And there's almost very few mechanisms by which we can incentivize pooling at the level that we need to, and congestion pricing is one of those powerful tools. And so I think it's really important in terms of getting to, if you have congestion pricing, it makes those pooled private services, for example, much more appealing. They can be offered at a better price because relative to the single occupant rides. And so incredibly important tool in the toolbox. Sometimes people point to equity implications of congestion pricing as being a potential source of concern. I absolutely think that those are something that needs to be addressed, but can be addressed through subsidies for transportation costs based on income and so on. So yes, that is a consideration, but I think that that we just have to leverage our existing transportation roadway infrastructure more efficiently than we do right now. And in order to do that, incentivizing pooling through congestion pricing is an incredibly powerful tool.
Oh, thank you, Don. And also that there's a natural connection to the equity discussion, right? So within the congestion charging, I mean, that's the most cited reason against the congestion charging is the equity argument. Say, if the charge is the same, then this is a regressive tax. But here, the question depends really on two things. One is, what do you use the congestion charging revenue for? Right? If you collect the money and you invest in public transit, then the higher level, that's actually wealth transmission. And then secondly, actually, there are innovation in the design through the individualized rebate return some of the money back to people depending on their income level to address the equity issue there, right? But for now, that's within the congestion charting realm. But I also want to broaden the equity discussion in the autonomous vehicle context as a technology. Does it have the promise to help certain group of society, either in the disability sense or the income sense or particular location sense, that AV can do better in serving this need if there's a meaningful policy framework to make that happen, right? So I do want to get people's thought on this, the equity angle, the potential for AV to contribute in this area.
I'm happy to take that one. Sorry, yeah. I think the one thing I'll just remark from baseline about the congestion pricing, then move into sort of the equity piece. And the one thing I would be cognizant of when we talk about congestion pricing, even for autonomous vehicles, we also acknowledge that autonomous vehicles are not really even on the road. That's in great mass right now. So the issue that we should be mindful of as we think about these discussions is putting a burden on a nascent industry that hasn't even gotten off the ground yet. And so you want to make sure that it's being equitably distributed, and then of course taken into account of equity, but also not overburdensome on nascent and emerging technologies. So let's talk about equity. Equity is an interesting piece because I think the transportation options that have even with Lyft and Uber, who have sort of talked about and gone into underserved areas much more than traditional forms of mass transit, for example, that has still been under scrutiny in terms of like where they are going. Can drivers really not determine where they want to go or where they want to drive or where they want to pick up? With autonomous vehicles, you actually sort of eliminate that subjectivity in terms of what that decision making. That destination and origin are sort of already in an app or are already sort of dictated to you. So you kind of remove that subjectivity of do I want to go there, or should I go there, or it's too late at night. It sort of automates all of that in terms of making that not an option. And we know that transportation has been historically presented in communities, and we also know the communities of color are disproportionately impacted. NHTSA reports that despite the global pandemic in 2020, the number of Black people who lost their lives in fatal motor vehicle accidents went up 23% in 2019. CBC's own reports show that African Americans also suffer a pedestrian fatality rate that's 60% higher than non-Hispanic whites at 2.65 per 100,000 people. So we know that communities of color are disproportionately harmed by transportation emissions from gas-powered single occupancy vehicles, adding to the disproportionate pollution and resulting in negative health outcomes that we so often see too concentrated in communities of color. So we are working to do our best in terms of autonomous vehicles, taking out that optionality, creating clean every mile being driven clean by cruise vehicles. But we also know that we don't have all the answers on how to best tailor the deployment of these vehicles to best support communities. And that's why we're working with partners like EV Noir to better understand how cruise can be a better, be a part of the broader tapestry of solutions for cleaner, safer, and more equitable future transportation. As far as the disabled community goes, Cruise is sort of the first to come and say that in our future future vehicle, which is called the Origin, which will house 6 people without a steering wheel or driving console. So sort of captivating on this shared mobility that we've been talking about here, all electric with sliding doors. We're also creating and exploring a wave variant of that. And so that will acknowledge the disabled community that has traditionally, even with the Lyft and Uber model, has traditionally cited that they are not being served. And so what's really interesting is that we've hired an accessibility manager who's also a user, quadriplegic. And we've been able to, even in a short period of time with her being on board, understand what the user community is and build a vehicle from the ground up to accommodate, what is the ramp height? What is the curb height? How does that match up? Where should the anchors be for certain wheelchairs? Is it only foldable, or how do we get, a motorized wheelchair in? And so really concentrating, doing research, having user communities to be part of that qualitative and quantitative research. And so to Mark's topic is that we need more data, and we need to be able to have some of this research and development allow to be able to produce better outcomes for these communities.
Great, thank you, Prashanti. So now it's time to really invite the audience to add a question to this. I would say it's a rare opportunity to have such a brilliant panel sitting together. So please do add your questions and comments to this. We'll bring them up and pass to the panelists. So while we are gathering this question, let me start with two that triggered by the previous conversation here. The first one is, Mark, you mentioned the notion that the clock speed, the difference between the business innovation and the government policy, right? That's almost by its nature, policy is often behind, right? On that, there are really two contrasting thoughts here. There's quite a bit of a paradox, right? From one side, we say that, oh, this is a new technology. We really don't understand much of it. So better sit and learn before you introduce something there, right? The other side, the industry say, no, tell us what you want, right? Give us the certainty so we can act accordingly, right? How do you reconcile this type of different point of view here?
I think that's, and Emilio brought this up earlier too, right? I mean, we're dealing with an imperfect world. Engineers in particular love it when they can go to the bookshelf and pull the book out and say, here's how I designed this system or answer this question, right? And I think like my mantra, whenever, folks internally at Zoox are trying to handle something that's never been done before, and there's a lot of that, my mantra is usually set the bar, which is basically, take whatever foundation exists, know what your objective is, and then set the bar where you think it needs to be. And then, to the point that I was making earlier, we need data to decide what works and what doesn't work. So even as administrator, I used to tell everyone, when you talk about supporting innovation, what does that mean? It means, well, I hope, this entire panel comes up with an innovative way to do X. But then you know what? We should have data that's going to determine which one or which two ways actually are the better ways to do it. That should become the industry best practice. Eventually, that lays the foundation for the actual regulation, okay? And so that's where that tension is that you're talking about, which is, we don't know what to do here. It's never been done before, but we can't just do nothing, and we can't just do all the things we think like, break it fast. That Silicon Valley approach doesn't work. I often say, when your app crashes, nobody dies. In this realm, when something bad happens, we're talking lives, injuries, etc. And so you need a balance there between an openness to the innovation, but let the data drive where we should be with either best practices or the foundation for the regulation.
Nice, yeah. So, Emilio, do you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great point, Mark. Yeah, for me, there are a number of things that need to be done. First of all, it is, even though it may be true that usually it takes 8 to 10 years for regulation to, go through the whole process, maybe it doesn't need to be that way, right? So, for example, in Singapore, as probably some of you know, I've been doing a lot of work in Singapore, both with MIT and the company. It's a smaller government structure, right? So it's easier to make a lot of those decisions, right? So we've been working with the Singaporean government to help, from our technologies point of view, to try to help them develop the regulations. And, there has been a lot of back and forward, a lot of feedback. And I think that that's a good model to follow to the extent that it is possible in other places like the United States. And the other point that I would like to mention, and Mark, I think that this is something that you mentioned before, is the importance of pilots, right? So I think that we cannot expect that someday we will have a massive deployment and everything will be done and everything will be set. That's unlikely, right? But I think that we really should have more pilots for which we the authorities, and everybody who has the power to kind of like to help deciding and regulating, developing the regulation policies can pay attention, to generate that data that then we will need to develop those regulations. So I think it is very important to keep these pilots in place and encourage them. I think that, really has the benefits of, I've always been pushing very, very hard for pilots, has a benefit on one hand to demonstrate the technology, right? But also to teach the public how the technology works. I think that there is, between the media and a lot of marketing, from industry, I think there is a reasonable expectation from the public that this technology will somehow, by some magic, eliminate all traffic accidents, kind of like eliminate inertia and the flat tires and things like that. But also, so teach the public what the limitations, and also the benefits are, and also teach the authorities and people in charge what this technology can do for their constituencies, right? And what are the benefits and how to regulate them and why.
May I just add quickly if the 8 to 10 years isn't depressing enough, what almost nobody knows is that every single regulation in the United States has to have a cost-benefit analysis performed by the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. And there's a group within that, OIRA, good luck looking that one up, that actually does the analysis. So what's interesting is, in the United States, you need about a 10 to 15% penetration of the fleet, 265 million vehicles, 10 to 15% penetration of that one technology just to get enough data to do a risk-benefit analysis, okay? So that's why I think Emilio's hit on something. This is an international issue. He's right about Singapore. Most people know about the flexibility that's available there. Every one of these opportunities needs to be capitalized on, so we collect data, and the US gets to learn from all the experiences they have. The other countries, that many of them actually have different kinds of regulatory type approval versus self-certification, et cetera. These are different complex international challenges. But the more we have folks actually working together to do not just pilots, but implementing things that collect data, then I think the whole world benefits. And I think it's an interesting, my last comment here is, there's not great globalization, consistency around the world for auto safety kind of certification, regulation, et cetera. And I like to point out, this is another one of those inflection points. With so much new technology, we actually have a bit of a blank page that we could actually think about more international collaboration, so that people aren't trying to develop one system for this country, one system for that country. We have a chance really to globally go after this as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. So here, there's one question from the audience coming. It says, the specifics of ethical decisions of AVs are important to consumer acceptance and to the ethics of the society the AV operates in. So what technology do we need to specify ethical behavior? And I will add to that, not just the technology we need, what social process we need to specify this ethical behavior and align AV ethics with the stakeholders, right? Anyone want to take that on? Ethics clearly.
I may. Okay, Mark, go ahead.
Emilio, please.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a I don't know how to say. A lot of people like to bring up the ethical issue, right? Which I think in some cases is a little bit of a red herring, in the sense that people will talk about trolley problems, right? And if this is something that's been invented by philosophers like 200 years ago, right? And then if we don't know the answer, how can we expect a computer to magically generate the answer, right? Or but also something else that people don't realize is that when they think of these what I think of high-stake ethical dilemmas, they forget about very low stakes everyday ethical dilemmas. So from a very practical point of view, a problem on which I spent an inordinate amount of time, and honestly, we haven't found the solution yet, is forget about the high stakes scenario, okay? But now you are, driving your car, and there is some obstruction in front of the car by which you had to invade the opposite lane. Under what conditions do you do that? Okay, so you are violating a law, right? Because you are kind of like getting into another lane that is generally accepted that you do that in order to not block traffic, right? Under what conditions do you do that? And I think that, people don't realize that this is actually something that is important, right? And need to be, we need to come up with an answer. And, this is an example of those situations which I think that we don't have exactly the specifications of how we want our vehicles to behave. Right. So that said, then there is another concept, right? So when you think of ethics and autonomous vehicles, I think that not only you shouldn't focus only on these high-stakes scenarios, look at low-stake everyday scenarios, but also is not something that is focused only on events, but I think is something that has to be checked on the whole process, right? So then more than the ethics of the AV, I think that we should think of what are the ethics of the whole development process, right? So what are the ethics of the company developing, right? And the autonomous vehicles, the software, and how is that process done? How is it checked, right? So that's why I think for me ethics is more like a process rather than the outcome of a single event, and I think that we should start thinking about that.
Right. Let me add two marks. One is in the narrow sense, it's a moral dilemma, this trolley problem, etc. Right. Indeed, as Emily says, human beings don't know how to do that. Right. The practical solution the society has about it is actually ambiguity. We don't ask the driver to predetermine a choice here. Right. When it happens, we use certain common sense, we tolerate certain choices, but in AV, we have to codify this beforehand. That's where the trouble really comes in here, right?
And this is very often, it is actually very easy to come up with these like gray instances where the existing rules and regulations are kind of conflicting, right?
Exactly.
And then you talk to a lawyer, to a legal expert, and you tell them, okay, so what is the right behavior in this case? What should the car do, A or B? And then they will reply to you, oh, I don't know, in that case, you just go to court and let the judge decide. It's, yeah, okay, but, if I had to write the code of my car today, I cannot wait for a judge to decide on a case 20 years from now, right? And then I had to recall like 5 million vehicles and rewrite the software,
Yeah, indeed. So therefore, a more productive discussion is to broaden the notion of ethics to this whole process, the system discussion, right? That's what I think will make a very meaningful contribution there. Mark, please add your thought.
Because I think you're getting and bringing this back to the equity issue. So, from a technical standpoint, you ask anybody who's actually developing these systems, and they'll tell you, you shouldn't be on the road if you have to ask that trolley problem question. If you're asking that question, get out of this industry. Okay, and Chris Urmson, who's the CEO and founder at Aurora and started at Google and Waymo, what I love is when he talks about this, he says, what this really does, and you just did it, Jinhua, it brings up the societal conversation of what's important to us. As Amelia was saying, all the ambiguity, right, that we've been able to live with, now you got to codify. And so that's what's healthy about these sort of ethics issues, is it makes you have a conversation about it. And what you're bringing this full circle to the equity part is that's got to be very inclusive. And so I would just say, yeah, you want legal in the room, but that's just one group. You need safety, you need the disabled community. You need as many voices as you can to have that conversation. Again, it's a blank page right now. And we have an opportunity, rather than leaving ambiguity, right now, if that comes up on any one of us, you flip the coin to know what's going to happen. Instead, we get to have a conversation about what we think as a society should be the outcome we would prefer. That's what the opportunity is now.
Indeed, yeah. So we only have a couple of minutes left. If the audience have other questions, please do add to it. So I will come back to one question that several of the panelists raised, is about the data sharing, or broadly knowledge sharing between the companies, right? That's where I observe another dilemma exists. As Mark, you mentioned that in airline industry, people don't compete on safety. So sharing safety data makes sense, right? But in the AV context, that's exactly one area companies saying competing, they say mine is better, right? So in this case, from the company individual point of view, that's the most guarded secret. I don't want to share with people. While from a societal point of view, clearly pulling the knowledge together, you made the mistake, I don't make the second time, right? So here, what's the mechanism? Is through a market will solve this problem, or through an industry alliance will solve the problem, or it has to be DOT just to push it down from the top, say, guys, don't debate, do this, right? So what's your opinion on these different possibilities?
Just a quick comment. This is something I'm actually quite passionate about because I put it under a category of never again. So if an autonomous vehicle company were to be involved in a fatality on the road, every piece of information from that occurrence should be shared with everybody in the industry, and it should never happen again. You shouldn't need every company to have to go through that same experience to get the data and understand, here's the lesson learned. And so to your point, if never again is going to happen, you have to share safety data. There's often concern about proprietary concerns, got it. But I think what we're talking about is sharing safety data very specifically. And you've already mentioned it. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but ASIAS is a system that's been 15 plus years in aviation, where major commercial airlines can submit data and it's analyzed anonymously in group form, and it's to the benefit of the entire industry. It's actually funded by the FAA and run by MITRE, which is an outside company. There are other anonymous reporting systems run by NASA. And so you get these outside neutral independent groups that collect the data, do anonymous analysis, do the group analysis, and everybody gets access to it. And to your point, I think this is a place where there's a role for the government to basically say, we have expectations that you're going to play in this arena. You've got to contribute data, not only contributing it, but put the data to use in your system. Never again.
Other panelists?
Go ahead, Don.
Even without explicit direction from governments to share data, which is a valuable mechanism, we do see some really creative ways in which companies and individuals end up sharing information that's valuable for private companies to create mobility solutions. And the example I would point to is OpenStreetMaps, which is a valuable source of road network information. So for those of you who aren't familiar, OpenStreetMaps is an open source road network data set available globally, where people contribute information about what are the roads, how do they connect to one another, what are the features of those roads, for example, speed limit, number of lanes, et cetera. And ride-sharing companies and other transportation and mobility solutions also leverage OpenStreetMaps among other types of road network data. And it's important the way the license is set up for OpenStreetMaps and similar efforts, it has to be done in such a way that, okay, it's fine for private companies to use this. It's fine for private companies to use this for commercial purposes. They can't build on top of it and not contribute back to the data set. Like you can't just take OpenStreetMaps data and then say, okay, I'm going to fix it on my end where I know there's a mistake or there's a missing road segment or whatever. You have to contribute that back to the community. That's part of how the OpenStreetMaps is licensed. So that's a great mechanism where it's a low cost way for small ride-sharing providers can leverage this open available data source. They have to contribute back to it in order to use it.
Shana?
So I think this is really where it comes into it's as much of a tech race as it is a trust race. And so there is pieces to this where, yes, of course, proprietary data is what advances the technology and sort of what makes competition. That's we can have a whole economics conversation of why that's good for the market. But there are portions of our operations and aspects that do heavily rely on each other. And there are synergies that I think we can make happen. Mark talked one about with regards to high severity incidents. The other aspects of this is just how is the autonomous vehicle industry handling as a whole law enforcement interaction? How are law enforcement interaction individuals who are very, very, very stressed and with their own resources and what is on the table and on these streets, supposed to remember, okay, this autonomous vehicle company said that in order to pull them over, we have to do X. And then this one said we have to do Y. So there is sort of a synergistic conversation happening with a lot of our industry players right now as to how to come together and be able to provide sort of a uniform approach. And part of that is acknowledging that there is data that we've all recorded and accepted. If there's someone who's an adverse public interaction where there's someone trying to throw something in a car, oftentimes they're not just picking one company over the other, they're doing it repeatedly. And so how do we come together? And from that standpoint, we can probably see who that individual is with great resolution from each and individual sensor suites. How do we come together and figure out what to do? And how do we approach the human interaction in a legal, ethical, and processed, methodical, processed way? And so I think there are opportunities to do that cross-functional data sharing that can only advance, not only from a policy perspective and a saving lives perspective, but also from a day-to-day operational aspect as well.
Great, yeah. The time flies by. We're up against the clock now. I think that's a great place to end the session. And this has been a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much, all the panelists, Emilio, Dawn, Prashani, and Mark. So all the audience, please join me. Thank all the panelists for the brilliant conversation. Yeah. Now I pass it to Professor Aleksander Madry to conclude today's full forum. Alexander, please.
Yes, so welcome everyone, and thank you, Jinhua, and all the panelists. This was really amazing panel. I learned a lot, even if I don't work in mobility. It was just really insightful. So I just wanted to use the last 10 minutes of our program today to kind of just say a little bit about what we have seen and kind of the path forward. So first of all, thank you all for joining us, and kind of what you have seen is the glimpse of our thinking about some of the critical directions and questions in AI policy nowadays. We try to expose you to different facets of AI policy. So the first panel started to talk about the top level discussion of how do we go about even imposing AI laws, and what makes AI laws be a good laws, in quotes. So in particular, there's a little bit of a lose-lose conundrum that Professor Citran nicely quoted, that there is either too early to tell and kind of too early for innovation, for regulation, or it's too late to do anything, because already the industry kind of figured out some steady state, and now it's very hard to bring it back to where we would like it to be. So kind of we have to really pay attention where we are on this curve and kind of act at the right time. The other important kind of question there was the difference between the voluntary regulation and involuntary regulation. Okay, so on one hand, the voluntary regulation or the big tech self-regulation has its limit. On the other hand, we should not impose too much of constraints on tech companies if there are other ways of making sure that that we balance kind of regulations and innovation this way. Okay, so it's kind of trying to maintain the right balance is very important there. The other important theme that showed up in this panel is this critical role of trust. And by the way, trust is has different meanings to different people in different contexts, and we need to be aware of that. And in particular, there is this role of transparency that it plays here. And when you talk about transparency, you again need to balance something. You need to balance the actual usefulness of information to people you are transparent to, versus the kind of resulting notification fatigue, right? So the famous case here is the cookies. Yes, yes, it's good to know and give permission to cookies that are kind of our browser accepts, but then getting all of these pop-ups feels counterproductive, and at some point we completely don't pay attention to this. So there is clearly some balance to be stricken. And finally, there was other important point I wanted to highlight is this importance of legitimacy of the law. So essentially, like whatever regulations we end up being with, it's very important that it is viewed and done by people that actually have are accepted by the society and chosen by the society. So it's not only about what law we enact, but also again, is there legitimacy to that law? Because again, we are talking about how we shape our society and what kind of values we want to uphold. So that was the first panel. Then the second panel kind of dove into one of what we view as topics that immediately emerge once you start being serious about AI laws. And the question that comes up here is the question of auditing and monitoring of AI systems broadly. So this is kind of funny, because this is something that if you look at the drafted AI regulations, AI laws, all of them kind of assume in passing that yes, some auditing has to be done, but never go into details. Kind of they assume that maybe this is something that needs to be done, but it's kind of solved and boring, and someone will work it out. But as we saw in this panel, this actually is very far from being true. So in particular, like there is even this notion that I think the society has to come to grasp that like AI systems fail, okay? They always will fail. So we need to figure out like, what level of failure are we comfortable with and how do we engineer? Because similarly, humans make errors and we have ways of dealing that. So we have to have similar conversation around AI systems. We also like really want to understand and need to understand this failure mode. So, if you can't measure something, it's really hard to improve on this. So we need to try to come up with some metrics on some of these failures. And also, it's very important, that was something that also showed up in the first panel, is that essentially when you talk about auditing, what we are doing is trying to translate some general values that we as a society decide to care about into particular rules or principles that our systems should reflect. So one other kind of technical problems that come up is this kind of composability of like the composable nature of AI systems. But this is very difficult to understand how different systems interact and what is the resulting behavior. This is particularly important in the context that, in many contexts now, we see this fragmentation, this vertical fragmentation of AI supply chain. So essentially, like there's no one organization that owns the whole AI system. These are many organizations, and then the systems get combined. But even within one organization, there is kind of a lot of complexities there, and kind of making sense of this can be really difficult. And essentially, the other challenge that was highlighted is the saying, okay, even if we figure out how to do auditing, well, the question is who will do it? Who will do it? Like, because the scale of auditing that we seem to envision that we will need is quite large. Do we have the human capital to even enforce it, to even make it happen? So that's something that I don't think we really think about, but we really should, especially given the already shortage of AI trained workforce. And the final point made on this panel that I wanted to highlight is that there's a question also like, how do we make sure that kind of the users can actually make sure that whatever rights are supposed to protect them are actually upheld? So there's a question of like, do we have to think of a version of tort law that is relevant to AI systems? Should there be rely always on external organizations that will make sure that bad things don't happen? There's a lot to discuss there. So after these two panels, which were more horizontal in nature, we move on to kind of dive into more vertical segments and kind of focus on specific topics and seeing kind of AI policy in its more mature and fine-grained form. So the first of these two panels was the panel on healthcare. And in particular, it focused on something very critical when you talk about AI in healthcare, namely data sharing. So essentially, data sharing is something that is absolutely critical for success of this whole field. Just relying even on synthetic data is not really an option, because synthetic data in particular is missing some very important long tail signals that we need. And also some of the minority subpopulations might not be represented in it. So we really need the real data. But now this is a problem, because this whole data sharing landscape, like it exists, there is data sharing happening, but it's very complicated. In particular, there is a lot of kind of friction in it that, in principle, many things are possible, but when the push comes to shove, this small problems come up, in particular, like cost of cloud compute, the legal overhead of figuring out the data sharing agreement that you need to sign between different organizations. And of course, as usual, it happens, the parties that need to pay the most of this cost are the academia and the smaller players in the field. So essentially figuring out, how to, revamp this whole landscape, how to create a shared infrastructure for data sharing is something that should be like at the forefront of our thinking in AI for healthcare space. And by the way, this is more like this discussion was more on the US focus, but like there are countries like France and also Brazil and Israel that kind of came up with a quite interesting solution in this space. So there is a way, and we need to think how we get there. And also we should think about this in the context of countries which don't even have digital infrastructure yet. And finally, we just had a panel that was, again, I really enjoyed, that focused on the mobility and kind of the question like how mobility is a very old topic. Mobility is something that is at least like century old, if not more. But of course, we focus here on the role that AI plays and can and should play in disrupting it. Okay, so in particular, one thing that was very clearly made is that, well, the problem with, in particular, self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles in general is that, well, it requires us to really specify certain norms that are never really specified. You know, like essentially the question is, you know, how do you actually want vehicles to behave? You know, there's not really like, okay, we have the, you know, the rules of the road, but they are kind of guidelines. In the end, you know, how we join traffic, like we have a lot of, as humans, we figure out a lot of things from context, and there is a lot of unwritten rules that, you know, that underlie everything that we do. And so now we kind of are forced to codify all of that. And that's kind of a challenge by itself. This also, you know, gives rise to a question about safety, like what does safety mean? Again, we have some answer in particular in the, you know, airline industry, but like, does it really, is it really what we should be after here? Then there is a question of like how, you know, this progress in, you know, in autonomous vehicles technology will disrupt different businesses. So, you know, one particular one was highlighted is Uber's business model, like how this will happen. But, you know, this is more broadly, like we want to think about all the stakeholders that are relevant in this space, and essentially like how, first of all, we need to ask, you know, how this technology will impact them, and how do we modulate it to make sure that this impact will be, you know, will be positive, because it's not guaranteed to be so. And the final point that I really liked was this kind of point that, like, this observation that, you know, in other industries, safety is something that everyone wants to collaborate on because that's the incentive. But in the context of, you know, of self-driving cars, safety is exactly your competitive edge, meaning like everyone just wants to get safety because that's how you distinguish yourself from your competition. So this means that there is no natural incentive for companies, industry players to collaborate with us. So we need to think through some mechanism that will incentivize this kind of this kind of collaboration. So these were just, you know, some of the highlights from these panels. We will post the videos in a couple of weeks, so you can kind of dive deeper into them and come back to some of the panels, because I really think it's worth it. And, you know, I just want to conclude by saying that, you know, you have seen today this kind of full stack of how AI policy work might look like. And, you know, needless to say, this is only the beginning. So I think the good news is that we are all, and this includes policymakers, recognizing that, you know, AI policy is the topic that we really need to grapple with. But the less good news is that we still need to figure out how to really tackle this challenge. So in particular, one thing that was really important is we need to learn how to think about this space, and more importantly, how to truly collaborate here. Like, how can we kind of communicate between the different communities? So the dream here is that we all kind of can meet together, you know, researchers, industry, policymakers, and other stakeholders, and really kind of talk to each other, understand each other, assess each other's concerns, and think together about solutions. This is in particular the mission of the AI Policy Forum. That's what we want to enable. But of course, you know, that's not only about us, that's about everyone. It will not be easy, but I think we can and we need to get there. So essentially, let me close by saying that, you know, I am really looking forward to the next steps. I in particular want to invite you to our AIPF Summit that will happen on September 28th. So in a couple of months. The summit will be in person, and we will return to some of the topics that we discussed today, and we will provide updates, but also there are other interesting topics that we have in works and we will hear about soon. So please mark your calendars. We hope to see you in September 28th, and have a great day. And thank you to all the panelists for amazing contributions.